Well, it is great to see you guys today. It's great being with you, and I want to welcome every single one of you that are here. If you've been coming to North Point a while, or maybe this is your first time to North Point, or maybe you're watching or listening online, or maybe you're here because of Camp 75 and somebody invited you here, however you've come, I just want you to know I am so incredibly grateful that you're here. Because today we're kicking off a very helpful and very important series called Guardrails. And I'm really looking forward to where we're going over the next 4 weeks. But before we jump into that, I think it's entirely appropriate just to kind of pause a second and talk about what actually happened last week. Because last week for our entire church, we had this happen, which is Camp 75. Which you're very excited about, and understandably so. And let me just tell you guys, I'm just saying there were so many incredible things that took place, and I couldn't be more proud of our church for what actually happened, and the way we loved and the way we served. In fact, what's really fun to think about is in this room, in this very room, we had about 461 middle school and high school students, and if you're curious what that looks like, that's kind of what it looks like right there. And it was mayhem, and it was awesome all at the same time, and I got to experience that and be part of that. And not only that, but the other thing that you guys need to know is this is just not a student thing, but this is a church thing. This is our church, and we had hundreds of volunteers open their front yards and backyards and drive and clean up and serve and cook food and try to feed 461 students. And it's just amazing where our church just came together, and we loved and we served well. And one of the cool things is that throughout the week, and Camp 75 was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, throughout those 4 days, which really fun to think about, is we engaged and impact 1,577 children. And what's awesome about that is that those kids, yeah, that's awesome. We should clap about that. We should do that. Because so many elementary age and preschool kids in our community heard that there is a God and He is real. And He loves you, and He is for you. And what an incredible message for so many of these children to hear. It's awesome to see that. And above and beyond that, one of the things that we did is we not only served a bunch of kids in front yards and backyards, but we went to community centers, we went to assisted living homes, we went downtown Austin and served people in need and the homeless, and incredible things. In all, if you were to add up and say how many people did we engage in those 4 days, it was 2,668 people. Which is really cool. Awesome. And one of the things that I think is really cool that I just think you may not know about is during that week of Camp 75, we actually had teams that would, start here in the morning. They would pack all these different meals, and then they would go down and provide meals to homeless, provide meals to people in need. And in all, we gave and delivered 581 meals. That's awesome. Yes. Which is so cool, and so many amazing stories. And so as I think about all of that, and I thought, this week, Camp 75, and experiencing what we experienced as a church as we came together, I just couldn't help but thinking of the words of Jesus Christ, where He said to you and He said to me, He said this, He said, love one another as I have loved you. And this last week, we have loved well, and I couldn't be more proud of our church and the way we engaged this incredible city. So I thought, to start our time, we just need to pause a second and just acknowledge what's taken place, because that's really cool. So not only is that very exciting, but the other thing that I'm really excited about is this new series that I just alluded to that we're kicking off today. And one of the reasons I'm excited about this is because this is going to be a series that's going to be helpful for everybody. It honestly is. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, or you are a Christian, or anywhere in between, kind of figure all that out. Wherever you're at on the belief spectrum, I'm just telling you, what we're talking about is going to be helpful, it's going to be practical, and it's going to be beneficial for every single one of our lives. So I'm really excited for where we're going. And today I'm just going to lay the foundation. Today we're just starting, it's like, chapter 1 of this series. And so today, as I lay the foundation, I think a good way to start is to define a guardrail. Because I think all of us have seen guardrails, we've experienced guardrails, but a guardrail, if you were to think of a guardrail, think of it this way. A guardrail is a system designed to keep vehicles from straying into dangerous or off-limit areas. A guardrail is like a safeguard to keep you from going over the cliff, to keep you from experiencing, those dangerous situations on our highways. And typically you're going to find guardrails in 3 different areas. You're going to find them on bridges so you don't fall off the bridge, which is great. You're going to find them in medians to make sure that, the oncoming traffic doesn't come into your lane. And you're also going to find them around curves. I mean, think about if you've ever driven in the mountains and you go around that mountain road and you kind of look over the edge and you see this huge cliff. And then you see the guardrail and you're like, man, I am so grateful that guardrail exists. I mean, that's guardrails. And guardrails really serve 2 purposes. The purpose they serve is to direct, to keep us in this direction, and to protect you and to protect me. Now, as I thought about that this week, and I thought, guardrails and their purposes and everything, I thought about a story of mine, or I thought about my life, and I just thought, man, I am personally so grateful for guardrails. Because in 1997, in my life, I made a decision, and the decision I made was to purchase one of the coolest cars, at least in my world, but to purchase one of the coolest cars I've ever purchased. And here it is right here. I purchased a 1995 white Honda Prelude, baby. And wow, it was awesome. And in 1997, it was used, but it was new to me, and I'd never had a car that nice in my life. And I don't know if this is right, but what I felt when I would get in this car, I felt cool. Like I felt cooler. Like I felt like a stud, I just get in the car and I'm like, man, I feel so much better about myself, which is interesting that getting in the car, all of a sudden you feel different about you. But that was my reality. And I remember, 1997, I got this car. It was about 4 days old to me. And I remember I was in Austin during a weekend, and I was driving this car in Austin, and it was getting late. I was hanging out with my buddies, and we were hanging out downtown Austin, and I decided to come home. So I was like, okay, it's time to come home. And so I get in my brand new car, I pull out of the parking lot, and I get on the frontage road of I-35. And I had about a quarter mile before I needed to make this U-turn, and I could kind of see the light up there. And what I decided to do in that moment, in this brand new car to me, was test out my NASCAR skills. Because I think I've got some God-given NASCAR skills. I really do. And so, I got in my car and I get on the frontage road and I'm like, okay, how fast will this baby accelerate? Like, how quick can I make it to the U-turn? And so I decide I stomp on it, I lay it on the gas and I'm flying and I'm going because it was an extraordinarily fast car. And I'm getting closer and closer to the U-turn. And all of a sudden I start putting on my brakes. But I failed to keep in context that about an hour earlier it had rained. And it was dark at night, and I just didn't factor all that in. So I hit my brakes, and not a lot happened. And then I'm getting closer and closer and closer to the U-turn, and I'm hitting the brakes harder and harder, and all of a sudden I start sliding. And I fly through that U-turn, and I jump the curb, and I'm heading directly towards oncoming traffic because under I-35, there are cars going this way, and I'm heading directly towards them. And all of a sudden, there's this massive crash and this huge bang, and my car stops like that. And as it stops and kind of the dust and, the smoke settles, a guardrail had prevented me. I was on top of the guardrail. It had prevented me from having a head-on collision with the car that was about 10 feet from me. And the car that was 10 feet from me was an Austin police officer. And I remember once everything settled and I looked through my windshield and I looked at that Austin police officer. On her face, there was so much fear, like her life was before her eyes. And there was also quite a bit of anger. And I remember she got out of her car and she came over to me and she did ask if I was okay, but like in a fraction of a second. And she pulled me out of the car and she was like, "What are you thinking?" And I told her the story. I was just practicing my NASCAR skills. And she wasn't very happy about that. But the point of me sharing that is not only am I grateful, but when it comes to guardrails, you see, guardrails are designed to minimize the damage. And as you think about my stories, I think about my story. I mean, things could have been so much worse. I mean, that police officer, her life could have been changed forever. My life could have been changed forever if it wasn't for the guardrail. Now, you may hear that and you may go, "Well, thanks so much, Buck, for the lesson on guardrails," right? What does that have to do with my life? Today I would imagine you didn't wake up this morning and you didn't go, "Man, I can't wait to go to church and learn the definition of guardrails." Like, I would bet you weren't thinking that. But here's what they have to do with our lives. Guys, listen, guardrails are not only important and necessary, on highway systems. But guardrails are important, and I would even go so far to say necessary in every single one of our lives. Because come on, think about it. Let's just get honest a second. When you think about your greatest regrets in life, when I think about my greatest regrets in life, so many of those regrets in our life could have been prevented or minimized if we had simply established guardrails in our life. If we would have simply have established some financial guardrails, or some relational guardrails, or some moral guardrails, or some ethical or professional guardrails, or some parenting guardrails, or marriage guardrails, if we simply would have had those in our lives, it would have either prevented or minimized so much of the regret that we have experienced in our life. And that's huge. There's big implications to this. Because what that means is there are things you and I can do today to prevent future regret in our life. I mean, students, there are things that you can do today. There are decisions you honestly can make today that will prevent future regret in your marriage, prevent future regret in your parenting, prevent future regret in your jobs, in your legacy. And that's not only true to students, but it's true to every single one of us. Every single one of us today can make decisions in our life that have the power and the ability to prevent future regret or minimize the regret that we may experience in our lives. So we got to talk about this. Now, the thing that makes guardrails, personal guardrails, and making this decision in our life difficult, or one of the things that makes it difficult is culture. Now, I'm not here to bash culture or say culture is bad. That's not my point. I'm just here to make an observation in culture. Because when it comes to personal guardrails in culture, here's what you need to understand. Is that culture doesn't encourage guardrails. They really don't. Culture says, hey, these lines, say I'm not going to cross that line. I'm not going to go, over that line. To hear the word no, our culture's not a big fan. What culture encourages is gray lines. That culture would say, hey, just be careful. Just be cautious. Just take your time. Just be wise or just be responsible, right? And those are much more gray lines. For example, think about this. In our culture, we hear this phrase all the time. Drink responsibly. Turn on the TV, or social media. Hey, drink responsibly. Now, it's a good idea. I'm not here to say this is a bad concept. I'm just here to tell you this is not a guardrail. This is a gray line. Drink responsibly. Because come on, let's just be honest for a second. Let's think about this. What does that mean, drink responsibly? Is that like 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks? Like when you're 21 years of age, you haven't fully physiologically developed in your brain. So does that mean at 21 you should drink 2 drinks? At 25 you should drink 3? At 35 you should drink 5? In what time frame? What's your body weight? I mean, what does this actually mean? Where does the line begin and end? See, it gets a little bit confusing. It's a gray line. And the other thing that makes this confusing is when you actually think about the impact of alcohol on a person's physical bodies. Because the nature of alcohol, what it does to you physically is it dulls your frontal lobe of your brain. And your frontal lobe controls your ability to be responsible. Your frontal lobe controls your ability to say no. Your frontal lobe controls your ability to stop talking or to not decide that. Your frontal lobe, honestly, it allows you to be responsible. But think about this. Every drink that you take of alcohol, it numbs and dumbs your frontal lobe, which is the place it decides or you decide to be responsible or not. You just think about the statement. I'm not here to knock this at all. I'm just here to make an observation and go, this is not a guardrail. It's simply a gray line. And that's not only true in this statement, but it's also true in a statement that our culture makes oftentimes to students when it comes to sex. We tell students this all the time. We say, hey, wait until you're ready. Wait until you're ready. Now, again, I'm not here to argue this. In fact, I would agree with this. I think this is a good statement. But what does that mean? I mean, when are you ready? Because by definition, ready means you have done things to prepare yourself to be ready. So what things do you need to do? Are they 2 things, 5 things, 7 things? What things do you need to develop to make this decision to have sex or not? I mean, what does that mean? And the other thing, just personally, is I think about this statement, I think to myself, there is no way a man came up with this statement, right? Because think about this. You sit down with a teenage guy and you go, hey, just wait until you're ready. I mean, their response is, I was born ready, baby. So what does this mean? Now, my point with this is, I could go on and show you example after example. But my point is culture, culture doesn't encourage guardrails. Culture encourages gray lines. And guys, here's what makes this even more confusing in culture. And you may have experienced this. See, culture will laugh at you if you decide to put in some personal guardrails in your life. But then culture will mock you and shame you if you have a drinking problem. See, culture will mock you and just kind of laugh at you if you decide to put some guardrails in place. But if you lose your job because of those ethical lines that you decided to cross, they're going to laugh at you. They're going to make fun of you all at the same time. And it creates all kinds of confusion. And it's important for you and for me to understand that, because here's the deal. If you decide to establish personal guardrails, you just need to be warned. You just need to know this. You may not be celebrated. At school, your friends may go, oh, you're so archaic, you're so old school. In your workplace with ethics and professionalism and being above reproach and all those kind of things that, with character decisions in your life. People are going to look at you and they're probably going to laugh at you because of these personal guardrails that you've established. But what you need to hold on to and what you need to know is this is also true. But you will have fewer regrets in life. You will. You see, what I'm convinced of is nobody plans to wreck their life. I don't think you woke up this morning and said, I can't wait to wreck my dating relationships or my parenting relationships or my marriage or my professional career or, my morality or my legacy. I don't think anybody plans to wreck their life. I just think we don't plan not to. And one of the greatest ways you and I can plan not to is to make a decision to have personal guardrails. So that's why we're talking about what we're talking about. Now, guardrails have been around a long time. They have, for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years. This concept of guardrails is not a new concept. In fact, 2,000 years ago, there was a man by the name of Paul. And he actually spoke directly into this discussion we're having today about guardrails. And Paul, for those of you who don't know, Paul in the first century was the most prolific first century missionary. His incredible story. And Paul would go around from town to town and place to place and share just incredible news about Jesus Christ and the fact that you can have peace with God. And one of the places that Paul went was a place called Ephesus. And now, honestly, I so wish I had a lot of time to tell you about Ephesus. It's a fascinating story, but it makes Scripture, it makes what we're about to read just come alive the more you know about the city. But a couple bullet points just to know about the city of Ephesus is that Ephesus is arguably the largest or the second largest city in that geographic region at the time. About 250 to 500,000 people lived in Ephesus. Ephesus was the capital of the occult in that whole geographic region, which means it was extraordinarily religious. There were all kinds of religious persuasions and all kinds of, occult practices that were going on in Ephesus. And Ephesus, inside the city of Ephesus, existed the Temple of Diana. It was one of the 7 wonders of the entire world in the first century. It was awesome. It was awesome. And the economy and the culture and the politics and everything in Ephesus, it was just booming and booming and booming. But it was a very, very wild city, and you could get in a lot of trouble in Ephesus. And Paul goes there, and he shared the most incredible news. That you and I can have peace with God. We really can. And it's simple. It's through faith in this person named Jesus Christ. That we can put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, that he is the Son of God, that he did die on the cross to remove the obstacle of our peace with God, which is sin. Like he paid for it. Past, present, future, paid for it all. And then he rose from the dead on the 3rd day to prove what he said and what he did is true. That was Paul's message. So many Ephesians put their trust in Jesus Christ. It's an amazing, amazing story. Well, Paul some time later, went on to correspond with these Ephesians in letters. And in Ephesians chapter 5, in this letter to these Ephesians, he addresses our attention. And here's what he says. Starts the whole thing this way. He says this, be very careful then how you live. And again, keep the context of the city of Ephesus. There's all kinds of things you could do to get yourself in trouble, to create a lot of regret in your life. And Paul starts this whole discussion. He says, hey, be intentional the way you live. Be careful the way you live. In fact, the word live, literally in the Greek, it means to walk. So it's this idea of hey, be cautious, watch your steps. Be intentional with your steps. Be intentional with your decisions in life. For example, think of it this way. If you have a large dog, and I'm talking big, and you have a small backyard, and that large dog spends a lot of time in that small backyard over a two-week period of time, and then after 2 weeks, you decide to walk in your backyard, what are you going to do? You're going to walk carefully, very, very carefully. That's the image that Paul is giving you and giving me, to be cautious, to be careful, to be intentional in the way that you live and the decisions you make. And then he continues and he says, not as unwise, but as wise. And it's interesting he says this, and I think this is important for us to understand. You see, in a biblical context, in kind of the old Jewish scriptures, that's the Old Testament, and the New Testament, the second half of the Bible when Jesus shows up, all throughout the scriptures, when you and I make decisions, the decision that we're taught or how we're taught to kind of filter that decision is not this. It's not to say, is it wrong or right? Is it wrong or right? Should I make this decision? Well, I don't know. Is it wrong or is it right? That's a very kind of shallow way scriptures would say to make a decision. A better way to filter making decisions in life is to ask this question. In light of my past experiences, current circumstances, future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? You see, wisdom was always the grid to make decisions in life. So what's the wise thing to do? I mean, if you're facing a financial decision, it's to go, in light of my past financial decisions and the lessons I've learned, in light of my current financial decision I face where I may want it more than I need it, but it's a financial decision. In light of my future hopes and dreams financially, what's the wise thing for me to do? And if you're here today and you're a follower of Christ, you have an opportunity to invite God into this. And I would suggest it would be important to invite God into this. And even if you're not a follower of Christ, you can do this. And this is a prayer God will answer. Just put God in front of it and say, God, in light of my past experiences, current circumstances, future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing for me to do? And I'm telling you, that's a prayer God will answer. So Paul says, hey, be very careful how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise. And then he says these words. He says, making the most of every opportunity. In the Greek, literally that word opportunity means seize the time. In other words, time is your most valuable commodity, your most valuable asset. If you don't experience time, you don't experience life. And so he says, seize the time, make the most of your time. Why does he say this? He tells us why. Because the days are evil. In other words, Paul's been to Ephesus. He's seen all the broken marriages. He's seen all the regret and kind of a young generation to go, hey, when they were young, they thought, no big deal. Everybody does it. Hey, everybody does it. I'm just going to do it. It's no big deal. And he knew life was connected. And he'd seen all the regret. He'd seen the financial regret. He'd seen that in that culture, it was very easy to make decisions in your life that would lead to a lot of regret. And that's not only true in that culture, it's also true in our culture. So he says, be careful. Be careful. Be wise in the way you live. Make the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. And then, Paul gives us an example of what he's talking about. So he sets the stage and he goes, let me give you an example. And what he says next, it's really important that you pay attention because what he says next and the illustration he gives is a verse perhaps that is one of the most misinterpreted verses in the scriptures. It's a verse that's been so misapplied. It's a verse that's created so much confusion. And here's what he says. He goes, here's an example of how to be careful in what I'm talking about. He says this, do not get drunk on wine. Now, so many times you've heard it said, the Bible says don't drink. Christianity says don't drink. It's bad for you. All this. It doesn't say that. This is where it comes from. It says don't get drunk on wine. Now, here's what's really important to understand. In the first century, this is the context it's being written to. In the first century, wine was everywhere. Kind of watered down wine was everywhere. Because in the first century, you would have these static bottles of water in homes, right? Not good water. And if you drank the water, you would be sick oftentimes. And then on the other hand, you would have kind of mixed water and wine. If you drink wine, you're fine. If you drink water, you're sick. And so most families, most people, most children, most family gatherings, they would drink wine exclusively. And Paul is speaking to that culture and he goes, guys, be careful. Do not get drunk on wine. And then he says, this is why. which leads to. In other words, he's saying life is connected. That this is one thing leads to another. He's given us this principle, this illustration to go, hey, life is connected and one thing will always lead to another. As I read that this week, I thought, man, this is so true. This is so true on so many fronts that life is connected and one thing will lead to another. So I just thought maybe for just 2 minutes or so, let's just play along with what Paul is saying. Let's play along with his example and kind of work this out in our personal lives. So think about it this way. In your personal life, think about this. Do not get drunk, which leads to fill in the blank. In your personal life, think about what has getting drunk led to? Or what have you seen people who get drunk? What has that led to? You see, in my personal life, as I think about my 20s and 30s, I think about my life, I could put so many things in that blank that have led to such regret in my personal life. How about you? When you look at that, does anything come to mind? Does someone come to mind? Or perhaps, as you think about this, is there a person in your life that you know would so wish that was the guardrail, do not get drunk, was the guardrail because of what happened? Because of that young individual who lost their life at an early age because of this? Because of that family that tore apart because of this? Because of that loss of job or loss of legacy or loss of reputation? Because of the physical abuse that had happened? I mean, I can imagine in a room like this, and for those of you watching or listening online, I can imagine there's so many of you that would say, my life would be so different if my mom would have just stayed sober. My life would be so different if my dad would have just stayed sober. And not only your life, but their life, your dad's life, your mom's life, their marriage, your family, it would have been different if they had just embraced this guardrail in their lives. Guys, you see how important this is? I mean, this is so important for your life and my life. Because, again, I don't think anybody plans to wreck their life. We just don't plan not to. And guardrails are how we plan not to. And so Paul, he continues and he puts in the blank. He says, this is what I would put in the blank. He says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to this word, debauchery. Now, I know this is a common phrase. Most of you students use this all the time, right? That you use debauchery, right? No, that's probably not true. Debauchery, let me tell you what it means. It literally means extreme indulgence. It's like, here's a line, but I go way past that line. And debauchery literally means loss of control. Loss of control sexually, loss of control morally, loss of control relationally in your marriage, with parenting, in your dating relationships, loss of control financially. And when that happens, it leads to something. And what it leads to is an enormous amount of regret. But you see, in our culture, it doesn't encourage guardrails. In our culture, it encourages gray lines. Hey, just be careful. Just be cautious. And it makes this difficult. In our culture, we're told to be careful. Just be careful. Hey, you know when you do that? Hey, you know in your relationships? Hey, you know with your morality, your sexuality, whatever it may be? Hey, just be careful. But do you know how you be careful? Guardrails is how you be careful. So, let's think about this. As you walk through those doors, as you sit, and we process this together, we have this discussion together, perhaps there are some areas of your life that have come to your mind. Let's think about those. Think about this. Where do you need to start? When it comes to personal guardrails in your personal life, in your story, where do you need to start to establish some guardrails? How about this? What is it you need to face up to? What is it that your mom and dad has reflected to you over and over and over? Or the friend who cares about you has reflected over and over and over? What is it your wife or husband continues to reflect to you? What is it that you know in your honest moments of life, that means face up to, that you know you got to establish some guardrails? How about this? Where are you driving on the edge? Where are you telling yourself, it's no big deal, it's no big deal, everybody does it? Or where are you flirting with disaster? Where do you in your personal life need to establish some guardrails? Now, here's the last thing. Here's what you need to know, is that when you establish guardrails, you are stepping away from something that harms you. And when you establish guardrails, you have to know this, it's not emotionally satisfying. It's not. Because your friends, they will laugh at you. And the culture will tell you, you're not going to be happy. There's so much more to life you could experience if you just cross some of those lines. Guardrails are not going to be that emotionally satisfying. But what you need to understand is this, is that stepping away from what can harm you, establishing guardrails, stepping away from what can harm you is a step towards the one who loves you. That when that's not emotionally satisfying, you're sitting there going, I so want to do this. Seems like everybody's doing this. Seems like it's no big deal. That thing in your life, that when you decide to step away from the thing that can harm you, you're stepping towards the one who loves you. And the one who loves you has something for you even better. And Paul wraps up the whole passage and tells us that. This is what he said. Don't get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, there's something better for you. Be filled with the Spirit. Paul, what does it mean to be filled with the Spirit? What does that mean? What does God have for me? He tells us. He says, but the fruit of the Spirit is this, love. In a way that you perhaps have never experienced. That's what God has for you. Joy, peace, forbearance, which is the idea of patience and perseverance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Can you imagine if that's what defined your life? Can you imagine the difference that would make in your relationships, in your friendships, dating relationships, parenting relationships, marriage? If this was genuine, if this is what you stepped towards when you stepped away from the thing that harmed you, can you imagine the difference it would make if you begin to experience what God has for you on the other side of that guardrail? Bottom line, stepping away from what can harm you is a step toward the one who loves you. And what you will begin to experience when you establish a guardrail is what the one who loves you has for you, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. And that's a game changer. So, for you personally, where do you need to begin? And we will pick up the conversation next week right there. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for this day. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your love. Thank you for the preservation of the scriptures that actually teach us things that are relevant to our lives today. God, you understand guardrails better than anyone. And I know for our lives, to make this kind of decision is difficult. So would you open our eyes to where we need to establish these guardrails in our lives? Would you give us the courage to do it? And Father, would you allow us to experience what you promised us, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control. I trust you with all that. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.
What's around